Hello and welcome to this screencast on comparing approaches and perspectives in psychology. So this is OCR A-level psychology. You need to be doing this with regards to the booklet, which is called Comparing Approaches and Perspectives. And you'll notice in the booklet that it has quite a few pages there. Ways in which you can do that, ways in which you can compare, looking for the similarities and differences between different approaches and perspectives. The easiest way to do that really is to break it down into methodological issues, which we're going to look at now, and debates. Okay, so what side of debates do particular areas and perspectives sit on, and back to methodological issues, what particular research methods do they use, what issues do they have with validity, if any, how do they compare, sampling bias, etc., etc. Okay, so we're going to start off looking at research methods and techniques, and in the second video I'm going to be going through free will versus determinism with you to show you how they compare in that particular debate. Okay, so let's have a look at this one. Then we're going to look at research methods and techniques. Let's just remember what are the research methods and techniques we could be talking about here. Remember, experiments, observations, self-reports, and correlation are our four main types of research method. But also added to that, we can have longitudinal methodologies. Think about Casey, for instance. Snapshot, which is just most of the other ones really. I suppose Milgram would be an example of that. Would be a snapshot study. Case studies, okay, Freud, yeah. And also as well, we might need to consider the use of scientific equipment. So do they use things like MRIs or electrical equipment of some sort, that sort of thing. Okay, so we've done that. Let's have a look at our approaches and perspectives just to remind ourselves of what these are. So down this side here, we've got our 5 areas. Okay, so we've got cognitive, we've got social, we've got biological, developmental, and individual differences. And if you remember, there are 4 core studies in each of these areas, divided into two pairs, and those 2 pairs fall under different key themes. Okay, so those are the areas. What about the perspectives? Well, the perspectives are these at the bottom, if you remember. Now, the behaviorism and psychodynamic perspective. Now, just remember that because they're perspectives, they're not necessarily associated specifically with a core study, although, of course, you can sort of add those to them as you're going along. So, for instance, you could talk about Little Albert here as being a study associated with behaviorism. But the thing that you need to remember is that actually there are studies within each one of these that could be placed within the behaviorist perspective as well. So behaviorism could explain certain aspects of those. And the same with psychodynamic to a lesser extent. There are core studies that have a psychodynamic perspective as well, even though they do fall into a specific area. Hopefully that makes sense. It's one of those sort of peculiarities of psychology is it doesn't kind of fall very neatly into particular packages. So all of these things really are kind of man-made false areas really, just to make a little bit of sense of it for you for A-level. Right, so what we're going to do here then, research methods and techniques is going to be the first way in which we're going to compare these areas. Okay, so let's start off with the cognitive area then, shall we? If you remember the cognitive area, so we've got 4 studies in that. Can you remember what they are? Yeah, we've got Loftus and Palmer, we've got Grant, okay, which was memory, wasn't it? And then attention, we've got Murray, and we've got Simons and Chabris. So what type of research methods and techniques do they use? Well, predominantly lab experiments. Okay, there's some questionnaires used in that particular methodology as well. But that's the major type of research method used there. So highly controlled lab experiments. Let's think about the social area then. Okay, so we've got Milgram, we've got Bocchiaro, we've got Piliarvin, and we've got Levine. So what have we got there? Research methods. Well, we've got controlled observation. Very different type of research method being used here. So big contrast there, isn't there? Lab experiments to controlled observations. Scenario studies you get in Bocchiaro in particular. Field experiments. Piliarvin, and quasi experiments. So you get a whole range of different things there, but what you don't get is lab experiments. The biological approach, so what we got there, we've got Sperry, we've got Casey, we've got Blakemore and Cooper, and we've got Maguire et al. All right, so they predominantly use quasi experiments. Remember, quasi experiments are is when you have an experimental setup, when you're looking for a cause and effect relationship, but the actual IV has not been manipulated by the experimenter. Okay, something that students do get very mixed up with, particularly where, say for instance, Levine. People think Levine's a field experiment. Well, it isn't. It's a quasi experiment. What else do they use? They use fMRI scans. Okay, so functional magnetic resonance imaging scans. Okay, you find that in Maguire. You also find it in Casey as well, don't you? Electrical measurements of brain activity as well. So think about Blakemore and Cooper, for instance. Okay, so there you go. So you can see again, we've got some things that are similar between social and biological. Okay, but some things that are different, and again, different between cognitive and biological. You know, bear in mind, you could be asked a question that could ask you to compare any combination of these things. Okay, so you could be asked psychodynamic to cognitive, individual differences to social, and so on. Okay, let's have a think about the developmental area then. Okay, so developmental area, again, you've got a wide range of different research methods used here. You do have lab experiments, so lab experiments, what we're talking about there, Bandora is a lab experiment, isn't it? Field experiments, Cheney was a field experiment, wasn't it? Quasi experiments, Kohlberg, I guess, is a quasi experiment. Longitudinal experiments, actually no, Kohlberg is a longitudinal study, isn't it? And quasi experiment would be Lee et al, wouldn't it? Okay, so again, you've got things that are similar and things that are different in the research methods across different approaches. Individual differences. So what we're talking here, we're talking about Freud, we're talking about Baron Cohen, we're talking about that strange old Gould/Yerkes study, and we're talking about Hancock et al. As well, right? So this is the only area really where you've got any case studies, and that kind of relates to Freud, doesn't it? Which links obviously to the psychodynamic area. Quasi experiments, again, found here. You think about Hancock, etc. Baron Cohen is a quasi experiment, isn't it? Review articles are used here. You don't see them in any others, so that's a big difference in the individual differences area. And you've got interviews being used here. Remember Hancock et al. Okay, behaviourist area. Now I've mentioned already, we can talk about Little Albert as a study within behaviourism, but we don't talk about that as being a core study. But if you remember things like Bandora, yeah, there's major behaviourism things going on there, isn't there? All right, anyway, lab experiments are predominantly used in behaviourism. Remember, that's a hard deterministic scientific type of study. They want controlled experiments. And the last one, psychodynamic. Freud and to some degree Hancock, I guess you could say, or psychodynamic studies, predominant use of case studies are a major aspect of the psychodynamic perspective. So one of the things I suggest you do is to have a good look at that and make sure you understand what it is that I've done. If you want to play back this video a few times just to make a bit of sense of it, that would probably be a good idea as well. But hopefully that will help and help you to answer questions in this particular area. Thanks.